The sport known as football by many, and known as soccer in the US, might seem a bit of an odd fit in the class on globalization. I'm going to suggest that this is not so, and that we can learn a lot about globalization and about how it is practiced today by exploring the globalization of what the Brazilians call the beautiful game. More specifically, we tend to take it for granted that major sports, and especially global sports like soccer, have in a sense always been global games. This hasn't really been the case, and soccer's globalization is both relatively recent and in some ways relatively unique. In this lecture, we will discuss how soccer fuels globalization, and specifically how it relates to nationalism and tolerance, shaping our understandings of how people can get along, or not, on a planetary scale. Before we begin to talk about soccer and nationalism, though, it is probably best to define nationalism, the first of the three parts of today's lecture. What you have on the slide are two definitions that I think do a pretty good job of summing this up. The one on the left emphasizes claims to land and common ancestry as key parts of the puzzle, something we see, for example, in Israel-Palestine or in Basque Country, where people's ideas of nation are rooted in where they belong on Earth. The one on the right emphasizes the idea of the nation as an imagined political community, one in which we will never meet all of the other members who live in the same place, but with whom we still have ties. Thus it makes sense to say that we are all Americans, Greeks, Brits, etc., through shared images and rituals of how the country and how the nation ought to fit together. This is the power of events like the Olympics, to get people to participate in nationalist sentiments and actions simultaneously around a common goal as spectators. Needless to say, the implications of each of these definitions of nationalism are pretty different, and I don't mean to make you choose. Nevertheless, you can see how these ideas about what a nation is and what nationalism is, in a sense, are really powerful and really can help to mobilize people's actions and people's ideas about where they belong and who they are. The classic assumption about nationalism in sport, in a sense, is that sports are an antidote to at least the worst kind of nationalism. This was the basis for the Olympic movement and for the Olympic Games. The underlying concept of the modern Olympic movement was that it would take place between amateur athletes, it would not be for commercial gain, and it would foster a real brotherhood of man through having people meet each other in games and sports. Needless to say, not everybody agrees with this idea, and Henri Desgranges' piece from L'Auto, the once upon a time French sports daily, which has existed under a number of names since then, really kind of gets to this idea of sports as a way to play out the worst of nationalist passions. The Prussians are a bunch of dirty bastards, dirty squareheads, mindless sheep without the slightest initiative and ready for the slaughter. And all the way down to you have to run them through. In a sense, sports in their best incarnation, in their best form, are supposed to be like the version on the left. In reality, and as we'll see with soccer, they often wind up being like the version on the right. And this, of course, has been a problem, especially for soccer, and especially for some of the tensions involved in the production and in the performance of the game on a global scale. Well, soccer basically was invented as a modern game in the 19th century. It was seen as an answer to urban health and identity issues. There were, to be blunt about it, a lot of cities in Europe in the 19th century which were getting crowded very, very quickly due to rapid urbanization. So you wound up with piles of refuse running down the streets like you see in that black and white photo on the right-hand side of the slide. Middle class and upper middle class people, seeking to escape those conditions, saw sport as a way of getting out of the city into the countryside. This is well before suburbs are invented in their modern form, but into the countryside, and as a way of distinguishing themselves as middle and upper middle class people from those grubby lower class members of the inner cities and of the old town centers in which they lived. Well, soccer spread through colonial ties and through World War I. On the one hand, European colonial empires were built in the 19th century, and army officers brought soccer balls. During World War I, during the various peacetime negotiations on the front, troops would get together and play soccer for a little while before they were ordered to get back into the trenches and start shooting each other again. Bit by bit, this leads to an extraordinary story of cultural diffusion, as Frank Lechner, the Dutch soccer sociologist, has written, from Europe and mainly to the Americas and beyond. Of course, there are exceptions to all of this. In the US, soccer really never caught on in quite the same way as it did elsewhere in the world. In Canada, they play hockey. Nevertheless, it has become a remarkably globalized sport. At the same time, it was also for a long time a small money game. From the end of World War II until the 1970s, soccer was remarkable for being a kind of small-time thing. Teams weren't even professional teams, they were clubs. They were usually privately owned by a family that had owned them for a while, a little bit like the mom-and-pop greengrocer shop. The salary scales for players were set on a scale relative to skilled craft workers. A really good striker on a British soccer team in the 1950s would earn as much as a skilled machinist. A superstar keeper might earn as much as an accountant. Basically, there was very little money paid to infrastructure. In 1966, when the Brits had the World Cup, they built no new stadiums. They put no new money into the production of the whole thing, which is obviously a very big contrast from the way the last few World Cups have played themselves out, to say the least. Well, Joas Havelange, who was the first non-European director of FIFA, the International Football Association, or the International Soccer Association, undertook to change all this. He was the one who got FIFA tied to big long-term corporate sponsorship deals with Adidas and with Coca-Cola. He bought Pelé, the best soccer player in the world in the 1960s, a little bit after his prime, to come play for the New York Cosmo in 1975 for the then unheard of salary of $7 million per year. He pushed for World Cups in the Americas to increase exposure of the games, in some cases even cozying up to dictatorial regimes, such as the World Cup in Argentina in 1978, which was being held in the context of a military dictatorship, which was torturing and brutalizing opponents of the regime. Despite the ethics or lack of ethics involved, this really started to build towards what I call the era of big money in global soccer. At the same time, though, other developments were happening, which also increased the cash flow and increased the value of soccer as a global commodity. In the 1980s, soccer was largely known to the wider world for being A, predominantly British. The English, after all, invented the game in a certain kind of way back in the 1890s. And also B, for being tied to hooliganism. On top of that, it was being played out in a context where a lot of stadiums were, quite frankly, in a pretty serious state of disrepair and in pretty shabby condition. So in Bradford City in May 1985, 56 people were killed in the standing room only parts of the stadium, where spectators were literally crushing each other and parts of the infrastructure was collapsing. In Heysel Stadium in Belgium in May 1985, in a match between two English teams, 39 people were killed and 600 people were injured due to a mix of fan violence and infrastructural problems and infrastructural collapse. In Hillsborough in 1989, 96 Liverpool supporters died in a crush. Well, at the end of the 1980s, the Brits are going to commission what becomes known as the Taylor Report. And the Taylor Report finds that soccer suffers from, like the quotation on the slide, old grounds, poor facilities, hooliganism, excessive drinking, poor leadership. The sport is in a shambles. So-called respectable people won't even admit to being fans. And puts together a whole series of recommendations to save soccer from itself and to make the sport respectable again. If any of you out here are basketball fans, you will probably be hearing some shades of a similar story, because the National Basketball Association in the late 70s and early 80s went through something that wasn't that different from what soccer went through in the UK. The long and short of it is that the Brits are going to pioneer a new idea. It is called the Premier League, which is sponsored by a series of corporate sponsors over the years, currently by Barclays Bank. The key to these innovations is that clubs are going to become like classic limited liability corporations. Owners are going to be able to put shares on the market. They're going to buy and sell shares. All of a sudden, they have a real interest in trying to make a lot of money really, really quickly. Usually by signing star players for large contracts to drive up the value of the franchise, drive up the value of the tickets, and then sell off their pack of shares some years later at a considerable profit. Tottenham Hotspur, which had been kind of a second-order, not-so-great English soccer team previously, in 1994 hired Jürgen Klinsmann, the German soccer star and later the US national team coach, for what was then the unheard-of salary of 2 million British pounds per year, or roughly 4 million US dollars. Malcolm Glazer, the Florida-based billionaire who owns the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, bought Manchester United, the venerable British soccer club, for a cool $1 billion back in the early 2000s. In 2009, he was offered by a group of investors $2 billion for the club and turned it down. Basically, soccer teams become hugely valuable commercial commodities through being able to A, sell their shares, and B, drive up ticket prices and drive up TV revenue very, very quickly and very, very aggressively. Well, obviously, one of the big consequences is that player salaries soar. It was a shock when Chris Sutton signed for the Blackburn Rovers, which was a pretty modest team, at £10,000 a week. Nowadays, of course, teams like Manchester City, which won the Premier League Cup a couple of years back, get far, far more money than that, and that is seen as kind of a normal thing. Long story short, we get a game that becomes radically globalized in the 1970s and 1980s through Havelange and through the actions of the British Premier League, which really tries to turn British soccer into a valuable commodity. Well, this is where this connection between nationalism, globalization, and the sport kind of all comes together. Glasgow, and this is something that Four talks about a fair bit in the chapter I gave you guys to read, is a pretty interesting case because for a long time it was basically a center of tolerance between Catholics and Protestants. The old line is that if you were Irish and Catholic in the 1840s and 1850s and you were poor, you went to America, you went to Boston or New York. If you were Irish and Catholic and you couldn't afford the passage to go to New York or Boston, you went to London. And if you were really a step away from starvation, you went to Glasgow, because it was the closest place you could go to and still hope to make a living. Well, Catholics develop parallel sets of associations, churches obviously, but also schools and social aid societies. Religious persecution is an extensive problem in the 19th century. And in 1888, we get the creation of a Catholic soccer club, the Celtic Soccer Club, which is designed to shield Catholics from evangelism and to provide kind of a center for collective identity formation. This is going to quickly escalate into the central point of sectarian divisions known as the Old Firm, and Four talks about this a fair bit in the chapter that I gave you to read. These two teams become pitted in this kind of quasi-sectarian and nationalist rivalry, where the Rangers, the traditional Glasgow teams, are the Protestant team, the Celtics are the Catholic team, and they kind of play out the sectarian rivalry extensively over the course of the years. Since the 1980s and 1990s, though, and this is something Four points out, a lot of this has changed. The Rangers, in order to remain a really good club, have begun to import Brazilian, French of Tunisian descent, and Honduran players. The Celtics, likewise, have had to import non-Catholic players very extensively, simply to field a viable team on the soccer pitch. On top of that, Glasgow today, and really since the end of World War II, has been a very tolerant place. A place where you actually have a lot of relative harmony compared to some other places out there in the world. And yet, at the same time as you have this, At the same time as you have multi-millionaire soccer players for hire playing for these teams, you have this rivalry that sometimes spills over into very, very violent passions and very violent sectarian behavior. And this is something that Ford talks about quite a bit in the chapter that you have to read. So, this is the question I have for you at the end of this. What exactly is going on in this picture? Do global sports such as soccer help promote globalization and tolerance? Do they help promote one or the other, globalization or tolerance? Or do they inflame nationalist passions in a way that's dangerous? Ford, in a sense, I think, seems undecided on this question, and this is why I think it would be a great question to discuss in our discussion board assignment. So, have a look at your discussion board assignment, have a look at what's being asked of you to write, and have a look at the guidelines as I posted to Blackboard, and start drafting a post that will start to get into some of the issues and tensions and contradictions in this complicated thing called the world of global soccer.